Hello there, John. John McWhorter. Welcome to the Glenn
Hey,
Show.
Glenn. Thank you.
Hey, we've been doing this for a decade, John. I marvel every time I think about it.
8 years, right?
Yeah, it's 2007, I think, is when this started, almost a decade.
Uh,
So, no more about the black guys at blackandheads.tv. We're just the guys. We're just John and Glenn. The John and Glenn
I
Show.
was
Or
typing
the
it.
Glenn and John Show. Let's do alphabetical on that one.
And this is our first one on Skype, too. So,
We have a new technology at hand. Lord willing, all will go well, and the world will hear us. So, John, my job is to frame the conversation. I think with this case of Abigail Fisher having been argued in oral arguments before the Supreme Court recently, Justice Scalia having asked a question about the mismatch hypothesis, maybe African Americans should start out at slower paced schools that are more suited to their level of development and then move their way on up and not creating a firestorm. The affirmative action issue back on the front burner in American public discourses. It's something that you've written about extensively, that I've written about extensively.
mhm.
Uh, it comes after a lot of turmoil on campuses, including some of the most elite campuses in the country, and the people who run universities being challenged by student protest, protest inspired to some extent by the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that. So we seem to be at a very critical moment in the country in terms of race and public policy along a number of fronts. And as I say, it's something you and I have been talking about for a long time. I propose that we carry on further, talk about it right here, right now.
Yep. It's been quite a year. If you think about it, it's Rachel Dolezal,
Ah,
the Charleston shootings, and then Sam Dubose, the McKinney swimming pool incident, all of that. Then Ta-Nehisi Coates' book and the attention paid to that.
yep.
Then Black Lives Matter becomes especially prominent. And then there is this new debate over affirmative action. All that's been in 2015. It's been a year. It's not a book that I'm going to write, but it would be a very interesting book for somebody to write in terms of 1 year, because that's the fashion in publishing, in race in America. This has been quite an interesting and also in many ways very frustrating year, especially now with the affirmative action debate. With Can you do me a favor? Because as you
What's
know,
that?
I have a cold today.
Mm-hmm.
So if you would give a quick summary of the literature about the mismatch that Scalia was referring to in his clumsy way, where it seems that the reading public basically seemed to think that Scalia was just making up this idea of the mismatch because he thinks that black people are dumb. Whereas I think that a great many people now don't remember the discussion of this literature because a lot of it was about 10 years ago, Richard Sander, etc. There is a literature by unbiased scholars that suggests that when students are preferred into schools that are above what their white equivalent will be put into, then there's a problem. And for example, the Duke study. Tell us about the Duke study.
Okay. So there's a guy, his name is Peter Arcia Decano. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Peter, if it's not, please forgive me, man.
Probably
Your
RTD
name is
opposite.
complicated.
Yeah.
Peter Arcia Decano. He's a professor of economics and public policy at Duke, and using data from the university at Duke on the majors that students declare when they come in and whether or not they persist. He noticed that there was this pattern, he and colleagues in this study, there was this pattern where the African American students were disproportionately likely, having declared an interest in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics type courses, the so-called STEM curriculum, to switch over to, if you will, softer, less technically demanding courses of study at a higher rate than other Duke students, even though when they were coming in, they had declared their interest in the STEM courses at the same rate. And he looked at that and found that that was the case, but also found that when you controlled at the individual student level for the preparation that the students brought to Duke, the courses they had taken, the grades they had gotten, their performance on standardized tests, and so on, that there was no difference between the black students and other students in the likelihood of them withdrawing from the engineering and science courses, from which he concluded that if the goal was to promote the presence of underrepresented minorities in the sciences, then that goal was being frustrated to some degree by the policy of admitting students with a lower standard of preparation at the outset. Call that affirmative action. Different criteria for selecting students if they're in the underrepresented group, less demanding in terms of their test scores and grades in order to admit them. They were getting to Duke thinking that they might want to do pre-med or they might want to do engineering or physics, but finding that they weren't keeping up and switching out. That's the inference that you have to draw from those data. That's Duke. That's one study. The mismatch hypothesis, and I'll be brief here, but you've invited this, more broadly is the observation that attending a school is, you can ask the question, how much of an impact does it have on the future earnings or occupational attainment or other measures of future life outcome to attend a better or a less good school? Okay, so a school that is very selective, that has accepting 1 out of 10 of its applicants, that has high average SAT scores among the students coming in, that is a more elite school. Generally speaking, getting a BA from such a school leaves you better placed in the job market than getting a BA from another school, which is less selective and less elite. So you can measure that. And then the question, if you're doing that kind of an empirical exercise, comes up, well, okay, that's for the school as a whole, but let's break that out and consider what the impact is for different students who might attend that school. Some of them might be at the high end of the distribution of students in terms of their preparation test scores, and some others might be at the low end. Now, schools differ in the sense that a Princeton or a Brown or a Columbia will have an average entry-level achievement score for their students that's quite high relative to University of Illinois or something, which is not to put down the University of Illinois, but just to observe the fact that it would be a less selective institution than a Columbia or a Brown. Schools differ, and then the students differ. Some of them will be very, very well prepared from the benefit of the kind of secondary education they would have had or their native abilities and so on. And others, by the standard criteria that we have to measure this, will be less well prepared. The mismatch hypothesis is a statement about the consequence of a student who might be relatively less well prepared in comparison to their classmates, and that fact might cut against the otherwise benefit that they would enjoy from going to a selective school. So a kid is mismatched, so to speak, if the kid is in like the bottom 10% of the distribution of the qualifications of all the students attending that school. And they might be mismatched at a Columbia or a Brown, but not mismatched at a University of the Illinois or whatever. And again, I just want to be clear that I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the University of Illinois. Mm-hmm. So the literature here, which does kind of begin with the study of students in law schools, that was a very controversial work by the legal scholar Richard Sander at the UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles Law School, where he was claiming that the bar passage rates for students who were admitted to a prestigious law school but who were in the bottom of their class when so admitted were lower than the bar passage rates would be if the same student had gone to a less elite law school, and then going on to claim that the net effect of affirmative action in legal education might be to actually reduce the number of practicing black legal professionals through this effect. The black law students were mismatched, he claimed. As I say, it's very controversial. There's a lot of technical argument all around on this. An excellent review of the literature will be published soon in the Journal of Economic Literature It's a paper by two economists, one of whom is Peter Garcia-Decano, the fellow who I mentioned from Duke, and another is an economist at Cornell University. And the editor at the Journal of Economic Literature, who oversaw the submission and refereeing of this paper, it's been extensively refereed before publication and found to be quite satisfactory on the technical side. That editor is a man called Stephen Durloff, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin and a personal friend of mine. And he's just an absolutely first-rate scientist. There's no BS here. He's not a conservative. He's not a liberal. This is just a science. And what this review study, overseen by Durloff, conducted by Garcia-Decano and his colleague, about to be published in the Journal of Economic Literature, what it finds is that on the whole, all things considered, taking into account all the statistical issues that one might take into account, the evidence is pretty persuasive that there is this mismatch effect that is negative on the outcomes that we care about for a student if they are mismatched, although it may not be so big as to outweigh the positive effect of going to a more selective institution. I'll stop here because I've been going on for a while, but I want to be clear about this last point that I'm saying. They call it the quality fit trade-off. That's what these economists call it. They don't say mismatch. They say the quality fit trade-off. And what they're saying is, on the one hand, if you go to a higher quality school, an elite school, that's definitely a good. But if you're not a good fit at that school, meaning that if you're in the bottom of the distribution of students in terms of the measured performance prior to admission, that's a negative. So we got a positive and a negative, and the net effect depends on the relative magnitudes, which is a tough call. They don't pronounce on that. They just say that the fit problem is a negative, and the evidence is pretty clear on that.
Now, all of that, I think, is invaluable in that we now have to contrast that with what over the past couple of weeks has been thought to be moral and intelligent opinion about what Scalia said.
Yeah.
Obviously, based on what you just said, the whole mismatch idea is based on serious and nonpartisan people with a genuine concern for the fate of young Black Americans. And yet, what we got was that savage cartoon with Scalia, and less noticed was that in the same cartoon, Justice Clarence Thomas was asleep. And what we get is tart, flippant comments, basically implying that anything that Justice Scalia said about race is inherently dismissible.
John, let me just explain to our viewers that the cartoon in question, if they haven't seen it, depicts Justice Scalia in a Klansman's robe sitting on the bench and has Justice Sotomayor looking over at him and saying, "Oh, I see Justice Scalia has new robes now."
There you go.
So, and Clarence is asleep in the cartoon. That's true.
Right. And I have a piece at CNN.com this week where I explain that I'm not a big fan of Scalia, but that in this case, he was referring, albeit clumsily, to something that is empirically real and morally urgent. And predictably, I have gotten a certain amount of commentary that makes it clear that for many people, the issue stops with Scalia said it. And Scalia is, of course, a racist, and therefore, how dare you support anything he said? A lot of people think that. And that plays into what we've been talking about in terms of where the race debate is, where the idea is you don't engage the facts. The idea of engaging the facts seems almost like science fiction. It's Scalia said it, and our job is to hate what Scalia said. Now, that's not new. Richard Sander. I watched Richard Sander give a talk in the wake of that law school article that he wrote. This was a talk back in 2005, and I will never forget watching a young representative of the local NAACP in what was supposed to be a debate with him, actually saying to him at the microphone and looking at him, while he somehow managed to keep looking up at her with a smile, looking at him and saying, "And there you are," how did she put it? I remember exactly how she put it. She said, "And there you are pretending to be a liberal and making references to your biracial son." And a Black law professor, and I'm even going to name her because this really chilled me, and I hear she's about to retire. It's Touro Law School, and her name is Deborah Post. And she sat and told Richard Sander that he was equivalent to William Shockley. And this is in front of law students, that's the way they treated Richard Sander for an article that, frankly, and from what you're saying, it doesn't surprise me. I've read responses to that article for the past 10 years. Nobody's ever smacked it down. You might have different priorities. You might have different opinions about what should matter. Nobody has smacked down his work, including all the responses after it. That is really dismaying because obviously the mismatch hypothesis is not racist nonsense. It's something that really needs to be talked about. And instead, what our chattering classes think, at least on, a certain side, is Scalia said it, therefore it's racist, and yeah. That won't do. I've been not surprised this week, but it's more of the same story.
Well, yeah, John, I again want to explain to our viewership who might not know who William Shockley is or was. I don't even know if he's still living. This is a guy, I think he was a Stanford professor. He won a Nobel Prize for his work on circuitry and, chips and stuff like that. Yeah. Integrated circuitry. And then he started writing about race and intelligence, and he was of the view that blacks were genetically, intellectually inferior, and he was willing to say that in public. So he's a bad person, and you don't want to be compared to him. Mm-hmm. I do think the phenomenon that you've just observed, which is a tendency to repair to that posture. The posture is, my God, you've spoken the unspeakable. By the way, yeah. You've just said something that is unspeakable. You've just engaged in Nazi-like, terrible analogy, but people will go there, rhetoric. You want to ethnic cleanse America's universities by, getting rid of affirmative action. This kind of language it's an interesting rhetorical move. Okay, it plays a certain kind of card. All right, and in the case at hand, Richard Sander, the law professor, UCLA, the mismatch hypothesis, him doing the pioneering work, claiming that affirmative action might not be good for its beneficiaries, is a political problem for people. And one way of responding to such a study is to try to discredit it to court, discredit it a priori, discredit who would ask such a question. What kind of person would do such a study? I don't need to bother myself with the study. Mm-hmm. We already know. If William Shockley were to come forward with some data trying to prove that black people are less intelligent, nobody would listen to those data. We already know we're dealing with a racist. Likewise, if a guy like Richard Sander comes forward with some data saying that affirmative action may not be the best thing since sliced bread, and we're threatened by that because there are people who want to hear that. There are political opponents of affirmative action. What better method than to discredit it from the root by saying, look at the motives of this person who undertakes this study. We don't have to listen to this. And I think you and I are in agreement on the position that, A, these data must be looked at because the consequences are vitally important, and we don't understand the world from our armchairs. We don't understand the world from our parlors. We can only really understand the world by engaging with the evidence that's in front of us. And B, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if this were true. One could still have all the goals that one wants to advance in terms of affirmative action, but go back to square one in terms of thinking about how to advance those goals, mindful of the consequences of what we do. That just seems like logic to us.
What doesn't get out is, for example, racial preferences were banned in the University of California system in the late 90s. Now, the year before racial preferences were banned at UC San Diego, exactly one person in a freshman class of, I think, 3,268. Out of all of the people who made honors, freshman honors, out of that class, one of them was black.
At Irvine?
At San Diego, University of California.
Beg your pardon. Okay.
At San Diego. Now, after racial preferences at the same University of California at San Diego, when students who previously would have been placed in the flagship schools, Berkeley and UCLA, were now entering UC Santa Cruz, UC San Diego, thoroughly fine schools, but not the flagship Berkeley and UCLA level. After that, 1 in 5 black students were making honors, making freshman honors. 1 in 5 rather than there being just one person. That is a cold, hard, and fast statistic. Now, we don't talk about things like that. That doesn't get out there. Nobody digs it up and tries to share it with the world, except in this particular case, me and the person who wrote the study that showed that. And so when we talk about students being placed where their dossiers ordinarily would place them, we're talking about success stories like that. People going to not the street and not to a community college, but just to a different college where they end up doing better. Yet it's assumed somehow in our debate about affirmative action that there's a Yale or jail. So if a person isn't going to Yale, then I'm not sure what people think is going to happen, but clearly they're not going to make any connections useful to going further in life. And certainly it couldn't be that they're going to do better in school. Whereas I think if you do even an informal review of all of the mismatch studies, it's clear that there is controversy about undergraduate school in general. But in terms of law school and people pursuing the STEM subjects, I don't think that anybody's going to knock down that data. It's very empirical. It's very straight. It's clear that there is a problem and that Black students would be better off if they were not mismatched in those particular cases. Our dialogue on the left, or even among liberals, has very little room for talking about that openly beyond looking off into the distance and saying it's complicated, which is really a polite way of dismissing any constructive conversation. That is very dismaying to me.
Let me say a couple of things, John. I mean, one of them is that the Yales and Browns and Berkeleys of the world are the gateways to the people disproportionately who end up in positions of power and influence. And so a sense that the underrepresented minority, in this case African Americans, Latinos, would not be present in significant numbers in those places is a kind of disempowerment. And I think that's one of the things that's going on. I'm not drawing any conclusion from that. I'm just making the observation that the stakes are really quite high. And people have a sense, and they will say so. I've had so many people write me saying, I'm an affirmative action baby, and I'm proud of it. I came from a modest background. I never would have gotten an education unless the University of Texas or Harvard University or some such place hadn't had affirmative action. Look, I'm doing fine in my career, and so forth. I mean, so there's that, and I just wanted to put that on the table. You can respond. The other thing I want to mention, though, is that any of this kind of study or this kind of talk, directly or indirectly, raises the issue of, are there differences in the performance between Black students and other students? Okay. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if I were to point out that the Asian American students at these most elite colleges are doing very well, that they're overrepresented in the sciences and the technology, that they are at the tops of their class, that they blah, 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 then a likely response would be, oh, you just engaged in the model minority myth, okay? Mm-hmm. And then people will say, well, why would you compare the Asian students? And then they will have all these things that they will say. These group differences are very, very difficult to talk about because they carry within them the specter of inferiority. They even if the speaker is not thinking that or not saying it, the audience will be reminded of the possibility of it, okay? If I observe, as I have observed, that I'm at Stanford University right now on a sabbatical leave. I'm up and down Silicon Valley visiting Facebook and Apple and Google and places like that and meeting people and finding out what's going on. I'm on Stanford's campus and I'm going to technical seminars in my field, which is economics, and allied fields like applied math and statistics and whatnot. And I don't see many Black faces in any of these places, okay? I'm just not seeing them, man. So I'm alarmed at that, okay? I'm alarmed, and my feeling is like the 21st century is being created right under our eyes, right under our noses, and Blacks are not participating. And anything like the level that I think we could or should. And to observe that is already an affront to many people, because if you cannot answer that observation with, oh, that's because it's an old white boys club and they're discriminating, it's just about bias and racism. If it's rather indicative of problems with the development of the latent human talents of the African American population, which are in need of being addressed, which are difficult problems, which would require hard work to address, then that's my position. That's my position. My position is that the paucity of our presence in these most elite venues is an alarming fact about our contemporary lives, which needs to be addressed and which is a hard problem. And to some extent, affirmative action is kind of like a cover for that. We get the numbers present, but we don't actually deal with the underlying developmental disparities. Then, maybe I can get by doing that because I'm black. People don't think I'm necessarily a racist, but a college administrator or one of my white colleagues or something making the same observation would be susceptible to being dismissed as Richard Sander was dismissed as a person with unacceptable motives.
And I want to read something that's important. I don't usually read from my own work, but because we're on Skype, free hand. This is something that I wrote in the year 2000, and the facts haven't changed that much. Of today's African-American congressmen, army officers, people earning PhDs from 1992 to 1996, MacArthur Foundation Genius Award winners of 1981 through 1988, and top 50 business officials, none but a sliver attended top-rated selective colleges. That was the facts in the year 2000. I'm not aware that it has changed that much.
You're saying that of all people or of blacks?
Black people.
Okay.
And so this is none but a sliver attended selective colleges. So we can talk about how you have to go to Yale to get ahead in the world. But in terms of what a study actually showed back when I was writing Losing the Race, which is, my God, now 15 years ago, it didn't really hold up. And if we think about super successful black people who we know, nowadays we tend to think of the Obamas. Okay, but is that really the norm? Do you have to go to one of those 7 to 15 schools in order to be successful? For one thing, I didn't. And so it's just something to throw in there. And Glenn, I do think in terms of what you were just saying, that a great many people, including some who we talk about offline, would say that it's racism, that the reason that you don't see black faces in the rooms that you're talking about starts with systemic racism in society, and then certainly admissions biases. For example, we were discussing someone who has claimed in certain settings that we need to change our standards of what top scholarship is in order to increase minority representation in certain fields. Now, the fact that we haven't done that is something that this person would certainly classify as racist. I imagine if pinned against the wall, that person would say that the racism isn't intentional, but still, for them, it's because black people are done a dirty deal. And what scares me is that it seems these days that way of looking at things is so entrenched among the people who have any kind of power that I despair sometimes that we're actually going to be able to engage these things empirically or constructively, except as a vocal minority, such as you and I seem to be. It gets frustrating after a while.
It's complicated, John. I mean, let's take this thing that you've just mentioned, which is changing standards in order to accommodate diversity. Because, folks, I'm here to tell you it's an unavoidable consequence of being concerned about the underrepresentation of certain groups that there will be pressure. You could even say downward pressure. And I want to qualify that in a moment, but let me just go with that right now. There will be downward pressure on the criteria of judging excellence if the goal of diversity, of greater inclusion of underrepresented minorities is taken seriously in a context in which history has left us with those minority populations being less well developed in terms of their human potential because of discrimination and racism. I think that is the hand that we've been dealt. Look at the schools in the big cities and so forth and so on. We've been dealt a hand in which certain populations of Americans have been impeded from realizing their full human potential by the consequences of being victims of discrimination. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So given that baseline, once you start trying to open up these exclusive venues like the elite colleges against that historical backdrop, you're going to have disparities of one kind or another, okay? The African-American students admitted under affirmative action may need remediation in order to be able to catch up with their classmates. Even saying the sentence makes me shiver in my chair a little bit because I know that it's upsetting to people, but it's just an unavoidable consequence of our history. Now, that being the case, when you start opening these places up, the temptation is to shade, relax, or modify the criteria of judgment of performance so as not to produce these disparities in such a stark version. One wants not to see it. And so, whether it's a professor grading papers from his students and noticing that some write much better than others, but deciding not to grade down the student who doesn't write quite so well, recognizing that they didn't have the advantages of an elite private school education and so forth, or whether it be at a tenure committee trying to decide who to retain on a faculty and wanting to have racial diversity and so forth and so on. Please don't misunderstand me, people. Please, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not denigrating the achievements of African Americans. I'm saying this is a necessary consequence of the history. Now, this is made, and excuse me for going on so long, more complicated still by the fact that sometimes standards do need to be revised. Okay? Maybe relying totally on SAT test scores is not a good way to run a railroad. Okay? Maybe in the economics profession, we are overly emphasizing mathematical analysis to the exclusion of other kinds of qualitative and historical kinds of analysis of economic phenomena with the consequence of exclusion. I'll give one story, and I really will stop. At the Kennedy School years ago when I was on the faculty here at Harvard, they decided they wanted to have more blacks on the faculty, and they were going to do it in part by hiring what we called practitioners, which were people working in public policy who were not necessarily academics.
Number crunchers, right.
So a practitioner comes in. The person happened to be head of public health in a big state, and he presents a PowerPoint. And his statistics and his graphs are kind of sloppy, okay? It wasn't all the I's dotted and all the T's crossed. But this particular person had an amazing insight into how you do public health in a big state with heterogeneous populations, big cities. Amazing, okay? So the faculty decided to hold their noses and offer this person a job. In other words, they acknowledge, everybody said, he's not really all that smart, quote unquote, but we need blacks. And to me, that was deeply offensive because I thought the real challenge of this guy was not for us to, quote, lower our standards, but for us to reevaluate our standards. In other words, statistical acuity is only one dimension of the insight into doing the thing, which is practicing public administration in a large state concerned with the health of tens of millions of people. Okay? This guy had a lot to offer to us that we had never thought of before.
Right.
Okay. In other words, he challenged us to revise our standards, not lower them. We, at that point, this is 25 years ago, were trying to think about him as lowering our standards, and we were willing to hold our nose and do it. In other words, we were missing the boat. We were missing what affirmative action could mean, which is a reflexive examination of the institution's criteria and a reassessment of them in the interest of the institution's goals, not to accommodate minorities. So given that that's the case, there will often be, for the people who don't like tests or who don't like this elitist idea about who's smart or who's good or whatever, they will often have a point about that. And yet, the other part of what I said is also true. Sometimes perfectly objective and reasonable and legitimate standards are going to be pressed against and compromised in the interest of accommodating diversity. This is a mess. This is a very difficult problem. I mean, please, people, again, out there, I am not an ideologue. I'm not against anything. It's a mess. It's a hard problem. We need to think, not with our gut, but with the frontal cortex up here. I know that sounds self-aggrandizing, John, but that's exactly where I am at this moment.
You're not an ideologue, but it's just that part about the brain and the gut. The general idea is that the gut is enough when it comes to these questions, because I think that people have been led to think that these questions are easier than they are. I think that's a lot of what's going on with the whole idea of a safe space as it's being thought about at universities. But it's interesting, this idea of standards, because yes, there needs to be always a conversation about what the standards are, how appropriate they've ever been for anybody. However, there's one pretty tidy indication of whether or not we're on the right track in reconceiving them, which is, let's say that we're going to de-emphasize tests, that we're going to de-emphasize, and you can fill in the blank with whatever it is that's kind of sterile and quantitative and hard. Let's take that away and use something that's a little bit more impressionistic, etc. That makes sense to a point, but how comfortable would the administration be with then applying those same altered standards to white and Asian students? And to the extent that somehow seems wrong, and everybody feels that somehow we're lowering standards by actually allowing other sorts of students to get in on that basis, then we're in a kind of trouble. And it's interesting because I have always
felt. And it's the kind of experiment that a Roland Fryer, the
Yeah.
black economist who you trained, I think would be very good at getting at, but I don't think Roland would be particularly interested. I think that a lot of the feeling about affirmative action among black and Latino fans of it who ardently resist the sorts of things you and I are saying, and then white fellow travelers, is a sense that to be really good, as good at the quote unquote hard things that white and Asian people are assessed at, would be a racially inauthentic way to be. There's a sense that to be a black person who could really just sail through all of that would make you somehow not a proper black person. And it's not a crazy notion, because the idea might be that if you're that good at what they do, it means that you're thinking more like them than thinking like us. That's not what we do, and you can think of it as being for socio-historical reasons. But if you're that good at that, then you're not really one of us. And I remember one time, I heard a black person actually give that away. And it was at UC Berkeley when racial preferences had been discontinued and it became clear that that wasn't going to change. And there was an undergraduate black woman who had been working in the recruitment office on attracting black students to the school. And she told me straight up, she said, and there's an article in, I think, the San Francisco Chronicle at the time that will back me up that this was happening. She said that the recruitment office was discouraging black applicants from coming because Berkeley was a racist place. And this is before I had come out of the closet, so to speak. And so I was just asking her, why would you tell them to not come? What do you mean it's a racist place? Why shouldn't they come? And she said, well, when it comes to black students who would perform at such a high level that they wouldn't need preferences. This is verbatim. I remember exactly what she said. A musical person, I remember. When it comes to black students who would perform at such a high level that they wouldn't need preferences, we're not sure that they would be interested in a black presence at Berkeley. That's what she said. She meant if they're that good and in that way, if they're Urkels, but in real life, they're not going to like us. They're not really black. I don't think that that was an eccentric statement. She said it to me as if I would readily understand it. I'm sure it had been discussed in that office and it wasn't something crazy about Berkeley. That is the feeling a lot of people have, that if you are that good at tests, you're not one of us anyway. And so let's just reconsider what it is. And frankly, that just won't do. It just won't do.
Let me see.
I understand. Well, very quickly. The reason that people might not be good at those things is socio-historically conditioned, and it's based on injustice, sure. But the idea is to make it so that we can be as good at those things. And then if we're going to have a conversation about standards, let's have it after we've shown that we can jump through the same hoops everybody else does. But that's not the way a lot of people feel. That's my view on that.
No, it's not. John, you said, in my mind, two brilliant things in that last soliloquy. Yeah, you did. You made me think, I know how to solve the affirmative action problem. Okay. Not to make it just class instead of race, but to open up lower class white people to affirmative action while doing race. Because you know what that would do? That would bring people who had developmental obstacles because of their class historical situation into the elite universities who are white.
Right.
Then those universities acknowledging and responding to the developmental needs of some of their students. I'm talking about Columbia, Harvard, Brown, I'm talking about the most selective places. Mm-hmm. They would then have populations of students whose needs they would have to respond to who would not only be minorities.
Yep.
In which case the response would not stigmatize the minorities who might be benefited by the response.
Nope.
And so acknowledging the existence of the problem and responding to it would become possible, which it is not now.
Nope.
You don't have to get rid of affirmative action to do this. Nope. You just have to bring in some poor white people who didn't go to the best schools and who can't speak the King's English with perfection and don't write all that well, but are smart enough to be at Columbia or Brown or whatever. That's all you have to do. So that was one idea that you said that I think is spot on, man. I believe that. Yeah. I think there's something to it. The other thing about authenticity, let me just tell you a story right quick because I'm writing a memoir, and I'll be quick about this, okay? Let's just say that I was one of those inauthentic people who had high test scores, okay? I did, okay? I went to MIT, and I was at the top of my class. I mean, I'm just going to tell you that. And any of my classmates will tell you that too. I was one of the smartest people in the house. So I felt racially inauthentic in that position.
You felt?
I did. I felt like I needed to prove to people, not to anybody in particular, and maybe only to myself, that I was as black as the next guy. And so I spent a lot of time on the circuit out there in the inner city street corners and in the clubs and doing the drugs and the housing projects and things like that. This is a confession. All right, you all. Now you know this about me. Buy my memoir. It'll be out in 18 months. Buy it. No, seriously. I had an this is a confession. This is me. I'm not saying this for anybody else, but I know what you're talking about. I had an authenticity crisis. Okay. And I tried to counteract it by behaving in ways that were self-destructive and not morally defensible, but which perversely I associated with real blackness as a counterpoint to this other dimension of my personality and my God-given gifts, which left me in this rarefied, completely lily white environment, the only black person in the room kind of thing. Now, what am I doing there and who am I and whatnot? And the way I was able to live with that was that I could say to myself inside, well, yeah, but you know what? I know how to cop in the, I know how to go and do the, and I can, and I could code switch with the best of them and I could, so I'm no psychologist, I'm no philosopher, but I believe you have your finger on something really, and I know you've written a book about authentically black, but you've got your finger on something really important here.
It's a natural feeling you had. I would be surprised if a person didn't have that feeling starting at the end of the 20th century. It makes perfect sense. But I think that it underlies a lot of the attitudes towards standards and affirmative action and what it's for. But, one of the hardest things about discussing racial preferences, and over the past couple of weeks, it's been clear that this is still a problem. Most people looking at it from the outside think that when you're talking about racial preferences at universities, you're talking about everybody has the same grades and test scores, whatever color they are, and then people take that pool of people and decide to have a certain percentage be of a certain color, etc. For many people, when you talk about diversity at a school, they think that's all it is. And so they think that somebody like Scalia must be Hitler because he's against anybody doing that. Now, I think people maintain a certain cognitive dissonance because you can't miss that the debate is also about what counts as qualification, whether SATs should be important. You can't miss that even if all you read is USA Today.
Sure.
But I think that because we're trained to think that our main job is to not seem racist at all costs, and most of us have a whole lot of other things to think about, there's this idea that diversity is just a matter of a thumb on the scale. And so to discuss it, you have to get across to people, no, that's not what it is. Our discussion has to be whether it's defensible to change standards for one group of people. And it's like this Sisyphean rock that you push up the hill. When I was writing Losing the Race, I noticed one of the main problems here is that most people don't know how racial preferences work, even though it's been in the news. And John Hope Franklin, of all people, the dean of black historians when he was very, very old, when told that this was the way it worked during the trials at the University of Michigan about affirmative action in the early aughts, he was appalled, but learning it for the first time, even John Hope didn't know that that's what we were talking about in terms of affirmative action. If even he didn't know it, and I'm not to speak with disrespect for him, but there had to have been a certain cognitive dissonance for him not to have picked it up. You can imagine what the general public, or even just many college administrators, think. And that is my phone ringing with a mysterious number from Queens. I'm getting rid of it.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the problems, that it's a very opaque discussion that, and I think many people will listen to a clip of what we're talking about and think that you and I don't like the idea of somebody deciding that 10% of a class is going to be black or Latino because of diversity. Now, diversity is a whole different issue, what you base that on.
Yeah.
But it's as if we think race shouldn't matter. We're Justice John Roberts. When that's not what either one of us are saying. It's whether or not we should change standards and for what reasons. That's the hardest thing about this. Have you ever noticed that cuts through what 9 out of 10 people who think they're addressing affirmative action are talking about?
Yes, I have, because there has been this colorblind argument, and it's really an easy target to shoot it down. This argument,
Right.
we should not see race. Well, I mean, what do you mean, man? We've been seeing race for 200 years, and then we're going to suddenly go into the business of not seeing race? Give me a break. Besides, everybody sees race, even if they don't own up to seeing race, and it's in our DNA, our social DNA, so to speak. So, what do you mean colorblind? So absolutely, people will think, if you raise questions about affirmative action, you must subscribe to some such ideology. It should be said, at least 4 justices sitting on the Supreme Court, that's Scalia and Roberts and Alito and Thomas, do subscribe to a kind of the Constitution is colorblind. The 14th Amendment makes all this stuff, unconstitutional kind of thing. But Glenn Loury and John McWhorter don't subscribe to that. Neither does Randall Kennedy and a lot of other people we could name. On the other hand, some of us do have the concern that you've expressed, and I won't repeat it, that the consequences of what we do, whether we subscribe to colorblindness as an ideology, are worth assessing and can sometimes be worrisome, and we need to check ourselves about that. So that's all true. I want to talk about one more thing if you got time, John.
I do.
Because you wrote me a letter.
I want to do diversity, too. There's a point that we need to make about diversity.
Okay, then we can talk about 2 things, and you can do the talking. But I just want to put on the table that the discourse on these questions is so fraught and difficult, and guys like you and me, sometimes feel discouraged and dispirited because, we're not winning the argument, right? I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates is winning the argument. John McWhorter and Glenn Loury are not winning the argument, according to all the various indicators.
Right.
And man, I got this letter from you telling me that you were going to stop talking about race in public because you were just sick in the head, fed up and whatnot. And I just want to say, please don't do that. Okay? I mean, we need you, John. We need you. And I just want people out there in the world to know that, just because somebody sits in front of a camera and smiles doesn't mean that they're not, suffering the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, which you and I are sometimes suffering, not to feel sorry for us. But, I want to encourage you to stick it out, John, because in the end, we are going to prevail. I'm convinced of it.
I should clarify that I think I'm past it. But
it's up to you. It's up to you how you deal with that. But I'm just saying, if you want to talk about diversity, say your thing about diversity. But I want to put that on the table.
This is more important. I was thinking, and it's, I'm never going to quit, but I actually...
That's great.
For about 72 hours, I was thinking, I think I need to bow out completely. And I mean, it would be a real complete blackout, so to speak. Just write about language. It'd be interesting to keep language and race completely separate. But I thought a blackout for just 5 years. Let this moment pass. And it wasn't that I felt that we weren't winning the argument, because I think, you and I know plenty of people, and I would say most of them are not white Republicans, who don't think we're crazy. And we had a whole discussion. That's enough for me. But I started thinking, I write for, I don't know how this has happened, but I write for Time, CNN, the Daily Beast, the Wall Street Journal. All 4 of those I bounce around these days. And I started thinking, what audience am I writing for, given the center of how race is looked at, and it's been so clear this year, is based on, for example, this idea that the black body is what we need to be talking about. And I really, as I wrote to you, I was reading a list of, who Time had decided were the mans of the year. And I must admit, I got down to about number 3, and just reflexively, because I hadn't had my coffee yet, I thought, oh God, one of the mans of the year is going to be Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I thought to myself, you know what? If he is one of the mans of the year, then I'm done for 5 years. I just thought, if that's how Time magazine feels, then I just need to bow out until we can come back to my vision of what reality is. Now, he was not one of the mans of the year. But it does get that frustrating that you're sitting there writing for a national publication, and you start thinking, there are going to be all these people reading this who are just on a completely different planet from me. And I hate to say, and this is probably a detestable thing to say, but I feel like for a lot of people, it's religion. I feel like sometimes I'm sitting there trying to write. I'm trying to be as much of a scientist as I can be. And then an awful lot of people keep asking me how many angels can fit on the head of a pin. And so for about 72 hours, and it wasn't because we're not winning the argument. It wasn't because I don't like criticism. Frankly, I don't read most of it. I just thought, Am I even in the same world as the readership that I'm writing for? I think I'm over it. But this year in particular has been such that I had that moment of clarity, and I wrote you right away because I thought that would also include blogging hits until 2020.
Don't leave us,
And we
John.
go,
Don't leave us.
I think I'm past it. But
You want? Yeah.
you see what I mean, though, don't you?
Yeah, I
You
see what
felt
you
like that.
mean. I mean, I don't write for Time and the Daily Beast, at least not very much, at Wall Street Journal. I post on my Facebook page, and I have my many hundreds of friends who comment back and forth and so forth. And it gets around. It gets around.
And those are your friends, and so it's
Exactly,
satisfying, I guess.
friends. but um, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on here, right? Because people will say, that you're jealous. They will say that, you envy the fact that other people get attention and stuff like that.
And it really isn't that.
So you don't, I don't believe it's that in your case or mine, but people will think so. And so, there's that going on. I tell you, I'm of a certain age, John. I'm in my seventh decade, well into my seventh decade of life. And I just get weary at having the same arguments over and over again. I mean, I'm writing this memoir, everybody out there in the world. I'm writing a memoir, buy my memoir when it comes out. And I'm reflecting back on 30, 40, 40, 35, 30 years ago. And some of these arguments are the same arguments, man. And I keep thinking, geez, is this like a house of mirrors in the amusement park where you turn a corner and you're back at the place that you started again? My God, what's going on here?
Yep.
So that's pretty discouraging, and it makes me think, I got other stuff I can do. I got a bucket list. I got a fuck it list. Let me spend my time, what little time is left to me, learning the German language or traveling in East Asia or whatever. Let me, let these Negroes and these liberals and all these people have their arguments, and, I'm out of here. Believe me, the thought occurs to me more than once.
It's been a tough year. It's been, because I would never have felt this way in 2014. But just sometimes you feel like you're not talking to people who are on the same wavelength as you are. On diversity, very quickly, I just want to say.
And we've got to go because I'm running out of time here.
Diversity is an interesting thing. There's an editorial in the New York Times from yesterday where a black physicist.
I saw it, man. I saw it.
She writes that.
Tell her name. Did you say her name?
I did. Jadida something.
Jadida something. I know,
something,
but
right.
The something is.
And she writes that black students or students of color shouldn't have to justify their presence in the classroom on the basis of their contribution as diverse persons. Okay. And then also what we've heard with the college student protests is that college students, and I've heard this ever since Berkeley, college students who are black, at least, feel discriminated against and being responsible for attesting to the black experience in classes. Now, in terms of logic, doesn't that fly directly in the face of the fact that administrators are saying that we need these students on campus because of their diverse perspectives? It flies directly in the face. That needs to be talked about, basically. And yet, it seems to me that somebody like this brilliant physicist can write an article like that, and we can have all this coverage of the student protests where they complain about having to represent their view on campus. They mock the idea that they're on campus for that, and that's fine. I can understand that view. I wouldn't have enjoyed it. I didn't like it. But doesn't that mean that then you can't, in the next breath, say we must have these students because diversity is so important to the educational experience? Why doesn't anybody talk about that? That's the sort of makes me.
This is the problem with Justice Powell's opinion in the 1978 Bakke case, which is the foundation of all of this. They explicitly rejected, the Supreme Court did, the rationale for affirmative action that would say, 400 years of bondage requires a response from us that's more than just not doing that anymore. Mm-hmm. Let's deal with the consequences of history by taking the people who were adversely affected by it and trying to develop them in an affirmative way. Instead, they settled upon the diversity rationale. Now, this is not our columnist in yesterday's New York Times' fault. No. I agree that her logic has some leaves much to be desired, but it's not her fault. The jurisprudence of the Supreme Court rationalizes affirmative action in terms of diversity, and that makes the beneficiaries of affirmative action into exactly what she was complaining about. That's why they're there. They can't be there just because we need to develop black talent just like any other talent, and just because they didn't score as high as somebody else, we're going to let them in anyway because we want black people to be leading this country too. They have to be there, according to the Supreme Court, because they bring diversity. But that makes them into a certain kind of object.
Before 1978, it was called tokenism.
Right. It is tokenism. In that register, it is. And they're representative of something, and they're meant to be. I mean, by the way, some of them can be fundamentalist Christians, and some of them can be atheists. Some of them can be pro-life, and some of them can be pro-choice. Some of them can believe in supply-side economics, and some of them can think it's nutty. And the color of their skin hasn't got anything to do with any of that. To expect them to sit in the classroom and, quote, be black, close quote, is asking an awful lot about those individuals. I agree with that 100%. But that's where we are.
That's considered a rational argument. And with I don't remember this physicist's last name, and I don't want to keep calling.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that I don't either.
But this physicist, if it's not going to be about diversity, then doesn't that mean that she has to give a different rationale? Because, of course, if it's not going to be about diversity, then we're back to the scores. Does she mean that there should just be a random lottery? And yet, that piece was edited by the New York Times without anyone asking that question. And so it seemed that she was just allowed to contest, to say that people shouldn't have to defend their presence in class. Okay, that sounds good. But then what?
Well, since
this is the mainstream media that is frustrating me at this point.
No, the New York Times op-ed page is very poor, in my opinion. I'm just going to state that flatly. I've attacked Charles Blow here. I think some of his pieces should not have been printed. And I think whoever edited this piece deserves to be fired, frankly, to be perfectly honest with you. Here's the deal. What she was saying, I read it, what she was saying in that piece was, black people in the laboratory, black people in the classroom, and black people in the physics theoretical blackboard make for a different kind of science because they bring points of view which, when mixed with other points of view, create a more fertile ground for scientific advancement. I think that's what she was saying. It may be true and it may not be true. She didn't offer any evidence for it.
It's only implied.
I just caution that once we start injecting identity into pedagogy, I mean, this is what we've got. We've got identity politics, which is I see a person, all I need to know about them is their group. We've got identity pedagogy, which is a black kid can't learn unless the classroom has enough black people in it. Now we're going to have identity epistemology, which is I can't know something unless black people weigh in. I mean,
their black point of view, right?
That's where I think she was coming from. I think it's wrong, but that should be the subject of another conversation.
Yeah, that requires defense. Historians are going to have a field day about the way we discussed racial preferences from especially 1978 with the Bakke decision until about 2025. It's very, very coded, and it's very easy to get lost. Like, for example, the 1978 diversity rationale, that's ancient history to most people. Most people don't know that traces back to actually a certain few sentences in one decision, after which Justice Powell said that cannot be the sole rationale, that to base things too much on diversity would be wrong, and yet that's what everybody went ahead and did. It's a very interesting history. Anyway, if you have to go,
I do.
To soothe my throat, then we should come back next week or the week after. Well, next week is Christmas, and so the week after.
Yeah, early next year, John. We'll continue the conversation. It's been a delight talking with you. Thanks for your time.
Perfect.
Okay.